Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Johanna von Braun. I work at the International Land Coalition, where I have two roles. I'm the focal point for Indigenous peoples and work on coordinating our climate and nature program. And I'm your moderator today. I'd like to welcome you to our third dialogue, which is looking at advancing the land rights through the Rio Conventions. Today is our last of the dialogues, and we will be looking at the Convention on Biological Diversity. Before we go into the dialogue, I'd like to add some housekeeping. We have interpretation. You have to click on the world icon on the bottom of the screen. Also, please introduce yourself in the chat if possible. So as I mentioned, this is the third of a series of discussions where we look at how the implementation processes of the Rio Conventions can be used to advance land rights and other human rights. We've seen a significant improvement in language over the last 5 years in the Rio Conventions, as well as related policy discourse that recognize the critical links between land rights, protecting biodiversity, fighting climate change, and reversing land degradation. Arguably, of the three conventions, the CBD and its newly adopted Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework has the most advanced language. Today, we will be hearing from policy experts, as well as some of our members about their experiences in the space. We will start the conversation with a technical overview by Maurizio Farhan-Ferrari from FPP and Amelia Aregin Prado from the CBD Women's Caucus, looking at national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and to what extent they've been used in the context of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as promoting gender equity. Afterwards, we will hear from three members, Pacos Trust, ONAMIAP, and PIPD, and then open up for discussion. We will end the conversation with an intervention by Olivier Rufundo from the CBD Secretariat, and then close the event. Before we go into the program, I just wanted to say we're going to have a quick poll. There will be two questions that you'll be asked, and we would be grateful if you could answer them. The first question is, what type of organization are you representing? And then you have to scroll down, I believe. Yes, you have to scroll down to a second question, which is what level of engagement did your organization have with the national implementation of the CBD? We'll give 1 minute for that. Okay. I think we'll be seeing some of the, here we go. We have a broad representation. 11% constituency based of people's organizations, some of our staff, international NGOs, academia. Okay, we have a nice representation. And then, okay, so we have some engagement, but most are planning to engage in the future, which is great. So then we have this is hopefully a good basis for this conversation. Okay, thank you, everybody. So now let's go into the program. I'd like to introduce Maurizio and Amelia, who will give a joint presentation. Maurizio Farhan-Ferrari is the Environmental Governance Coordinator of the Forest Peoples Program, and Amelia Aregin Prado is the coordinator of the CBD Women's Caucus. We'll give 15 minutes for this, after which we move to our members' experiences. Maurizio, Amelia, please go ahead.
Many thanks, Johanna, and good day, everyone, wherever you are. So yeah, Amelia and I are going to share this. So Amelia is managing the slides. So if we can go to the next one, Amelia. I mean, the focus here is to look at the Convention on Biological Diversity and how land rights are being addressed there. We have a very quick introduction to the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. I mean, I think everybody knows what the key objectives of the conventions are, but just to remind ourselves, the convention's objectives are to conserve biodiversity, to the sustainable use of biodiversity, and then the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. So over its life, when it started, it was ratified in 1993. And then there was a target 2010, and then there was a whole strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020. And then, as you know, there is a new Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted at COP15 in 2022. Now, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans has always been the main vehicle through which parties or governments, in collaboration with all the relevant organizations, are expected to implement the convention at the national and subnational level. So it is stated in Article 6 of the convention itself that each party shall develop national strategy, plans, or programs for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, or to adapt for this purpose existing strategies, plans, or programs, which shall reflect the measures set out in the convention, and to integrate as far as possible and as appropriate the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity into relevant sectoral and cross-sectoral plans, programs, and policies, which has become to be known as mainstreaming of biodiversity across sustainable development and all of the other national policies. So if you can go to, so on the right side is just an example of, this is the NBSAPs being developed by Madagascar. So in this case, it was, covering 10 years, 2015 to 2025. So it actually straddles between the two strategic plans. So, but what was important is from COP15, given the content of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, is that each party, each government is expected to update and revise the NBSAPs. And most of them are doing it right now because they're supposed to report back on their updating by COP16 in October this year. Now, how are Indigenous peoples and local communities being reflected in the NBSAPs? So some analysis was carried out when the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity produced the two local biodiversity outlooks. So the first edition was launched in COP13 in 2016, which is the one in the middle. And the second one, the Local Biodiversity Outlook 2, was launched together with the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 in 2020. And if we go to the next slide, as some of the key messages, and we are not going to go through all the key messages, but one of the things that stood out is that Aichi Biodiversity Target 18, which deals with Indigenous people and local communities, particularly traditional knowledge and customer sustainable use, has not been met. And only 10% of the parties were actually engaging Indigenous people and local communities in the planning and development of the NBSAPs. So this was considered, a massive missed opportunity during the strategic plan 2011-2020 of not really engaging some of the central actors in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use in the national policies and the subnational implementation. So one of the key messages from the LBO was that putting the cultures and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities at the heart of the 2050 biodiversity strategy and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which then led to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, should become a priority, both for outcome for biodiversity and climate and for human well-being. So if we can go to the next one then, some of those recommendations did actually get reflected in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So the COP decisions, the 15/4, that adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework already included, a text on securing the full and effective contributions of women, youth, indigenous peoples, and local communities and civil society organizations in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And also, it reaffirmed the expectations that parties and other governments will ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are respected, and not only respected, but also should be given effect in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework itself. So those are two of the paragraphs in the decision itself. The Global Biodiversity Framework is an annex to that decision. Importantly, it includes Section C of the GBF, which is cross-cutting considerations for the implementation and monitoring and reporting of the GBF. So amongst all those cross-cutting considerations, the first one listed there is actually recognizing the contributions and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is quite strong text, but we're not going to read the whole paragraph there. But it's basically to say that the implementation of the GBF needs to be done in accordance, for example, with the relevant national legislation, but also international instruments, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and human rights law. So this is a cross-cutting consideration that applies to all the goals and targets of the GBF. If we can go to the next one. The recognition of rights of indigenous people and communities, and particularly actually to land, is recognized in a number of targets as well. For example, target 1 on spatial planning to address threats to biodiversity. It calls for all areas to be under participatory, integrated, and biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. And while respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, while it does not specifically mention rights to land, but of course, in terms of spatial planning, rights to land is a fundamental one here, as well as the right to participation. Then if we go to the next one, for example, target 3, the quite well-known target, the 30 by 30 on protected and conserved areas, it does include that that target is to be achieved through well-connected and equitable governance systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, recognizing indigenous and traditional territories. And all of the target is a complicated, multifaceted target, but all of it at the end needs to recognize and respect the rights of indigenous people and local communities, including over the traditional territories, at the end of the target, as you can see next. Then if we go to target 22, which is a central target for indigenous people and local communities and environmental human rights defenders, again, it calls for full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation and participation, but taking into account and respecting their cultures and their rights over land, territories, and resources. So this is text that was not present in the previous strategic plan for biodiversity. So this was the outcome basically of years of engagement and advocacy, particularly of the caucus of indigenous peoples and local communities who have been participating in the CBD over decades. Now, there is another COP15 decision, which is quite important. It is on planning, monitoring, reporting, and reviewing, because it specifically addresses the mechanisms for implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So here it includes that national biodiversity strategy and action plans should be or are expected to be revised and updated to align with the GBF. As I was saying, it's been doing now for reporting by COP16 in October this year. And then the national reports that are expected to be submitted in February 2026 and then in June 2029 should include headline and binary and other indicators. And they should also be done in a participatory way as much as possible. So these national reports will start to be compiled actually in 2025. So we are not very far off from that either. And then a global analysis of information in MB-SAPs to address the contributions is to achieve the global targets is to be done at each and every COP from COP16 onward. Then if we can go to the next one. This is just an example, is an annex in that decision, which is a template through which the MB-SAPs are being revised and updated. So, for example, each government, each party is going to set their national targets, which needs to align with the global targets in the GBF. Then if we can go to the next one. They are going to indicate how they're going to use the headline component as well as complementary and binary indicators in the development of the MB-SAPs. So we don't have much time to go into the details of the monitoring framework and the various indicators, but basically the parties are required to use the headline and the binary indicators. And we can see a couple of samples later on. And then they can choose which of the component and complementary indicators to use at the national level. They can also use their own national indicators as well as sub-national indicator. And that's where, for example, community-developed indicators and community-based monitoring information system become relevant in the whole monitoring framework. Yes, we can go to the next one. Okay, so there is also the development and operationalization of the so-called indicators on traditional knowledge. These are 4 indicators that have been adopted by the COP from COP7 to COP13. So, for example, the one on the status and trends on linguistic diversity was the first one to be adopted at COP7. Then in COP13, the one on status and trends in land use change and land tenure in the traditional territories of indigenous and local communities, which is very central to what we're discussing here today, was adopted at COP10, together with the status and trends in practice of traditional occupations. And then there is a 4th one, which was adopted at COP13 in 2016, on respect for traditional knowledge, including through full and effective participation. So these 4 TK indicators are very important. However, there were not really sufficient resources and focus for their operationalization since they were adopted. But now, since last year, with the working group on Article 8J and related provisions, and the integration of traditional knowledge indicators into the monitoring framework, renewed attention has been paid to these 4 traditional knowledge indicators, and very detailed metadata sheets, including all the details, have been developed over the past few months. And they were shared with the ad hoc technical expert group on indicators last month, and will be included in the discussion of Substa 26 next month. So if we can go to the next one.
Sorry, Mauricio, to interrupt. You've got to speed it up a bit so we can move to Amelia.
Sure. So in terms of the trends in land use change, this is actually being developed specifically by the ILC together with FAO, and it's 2 indicators being developed in there. One is on the proportion of lands and territories held or used by indigenous peoples and local communities, and the other one is on land use and land use change in those lands. The expert workshop provided some recommendations. Some of those are already reflected in the Substa official documents for negotiation next month. For example, by disaggregation by indigenous and traditional territories for a number of headline indicators, for example, on the red list of ecosystems and the extent of natural ecosystems. And this same also apply to target 1, 2, and 3 of the GBF and target 22. Yes, we can go to the next one. And that's passing over to Amelia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mauricio, and hello, Joanna and everyone. And now I'm going to build on Maritza's intervention just to share some entry points that have been built or created within the CBD decisions in the last COP. And also following the decision 15.4, which is the document where the global biodiversity framework is spelled out. Coming back to section C, as Mauricio mentioned, this section is the one that provides a series of provisions that should be considered while implementing the GBF, and therefore also while the designing and implementing the MBSAPs. And apart from the IPs and LCs provision, there are two other critical that are for the women's rights agenda. One is the human rights-based approach as a spelled out provision that should be taken into account, but also that the recognition that the successful implementation of the framework will depend on ensuring gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. But apart from section C, which sometimes could be seen as something sort of voluntary, because we don't know and that's one thing that has been discussed and worked on these months on how to actually measure section C. We have what could be seen as a stronger provision, which is target 23. That is the first dedicated target within any of the Rio conventions to actually look for ensuring the gender responsive implementation or the gender responsive approach of the whole framework. But this target is also special and relevant for us today because it has this explicit mention of the need to recognition and ensuring the rights of women and girls to land and natural resources. So when developing the national targets related to target 23, the women's rights land should be actually included in the MBSAPs. But apart from this decision, we also wanted today to bring attention to parallel decisions or other instruments that were also adopted that should be equally implemented or that were designed with the aim of supporting the implementation of the whole framework. And one particular and a main decision for us, and perhaps Olivier could also mention about the gender plan of action decision, because this gender plan of action was developed with thinking on how to support the GBF, therefore how to support the MBSAPs implementation. And there it has a full dedicated objective on increasing women and girls' rights, ownership and control over land and access to natural resources and water. And it has indicative actions, it has possible deliverables, so it is an instructive and guiding document that could be used at the national level to identify which are the actions needed to ensure women's rights to land and resources. But the tricky part that we have identified is, okay, we have these provisions both in the GBF and in the gender plan of action, but at the end, we know that if something is not measured, if something is not monitored, then it's not really a way of saying if we achieve it or not. And this is one of the parts that we have been trying to contribute to bridge this gap, because in this other decision where the monitoring framework to measure the progress of the GBF was addressed, target 23 went without a headline indicator, which the headline indicators are the ones seen as the obligatory or the mandatory, and the others are just there to be, well, that component or complement. And there in the component is where we see like proposed indicators coming from the SDGs arena in where to identify if women are having able to exercise their rights to land and natural resources. But what the CBD Women's Caucus has been trying to do with many other colleagues, including ILC and FPP, is to push for having a headline indicator on target 23 that could be the implementation of the gender plan of action, because that would include measures on if women's land rights had been adopted or not. And in parallel, we have that this decision 15.6 on the national reports that Mauricio mentioned somehow include some elements to measure if, for example, in the process of developing the MBSAPs, women, IPs and LCs, youth, or other rights holders were included. But this, again, is just going to be a matter of a narrative from the governments. No, it's not necessarily going to measure how meaningful that participation was or not. It's just if they were involved in the development of the MBSAPs. And another important element of this report for template for the 7th national report is that at the very end, the parties could, it is suggested for parties to mention if they, or on how they implemented, among others, the gender plan of action. So we see that in the gender plan of action, we have a critical provision on women's land rights, but at the end, the reporting or the evidence to support that report is not necessarily as strong as needed to actually prove that those rights were guaranteed. And knowing that we are over time, I think that perhaps, Mauricio, if you agree, we can just go to the last 2 slides about potential actions. No, like we have shared a bit of the how is looking the scenario at this point in terms of which are the measures taken in, or the decisions made in COP, but what could be actually done on the ground. So perhaps, Mauricio, if you're okay, you can share a bit about these suggested actions.
Oh, thanks a lot, Amelia. Yeah, basically, one option is to try to engage in the revision and updating of the MBSAPs. Well, during 2024, as we mentioned earlier, it's happening right now. So in some countries, there might still be some space for participation, but yeah, we know that, for example, that in some countries, there has been a participation of indigenous political communities, women and youth. But I think it's been improving since the past round of MBSAPs, but it's still a very mixed picture. So we will only know later this year how this is taking place. And then to explore participation in national reporting, both in the national official channel, but also through complementary reporting. And then I think one of the key things is how to instill and develop collaboration with indigenous people communities, women and youth organizations and network engaged in MBSAPs updating in as many countries as is possible to do. Because the more it is a collaborative approach in terms of participation, I think the better the chance is to ensure that there is participation in these processes. But of course, there could be other potential options that can come out from the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you
so
both.
much. Yeah, and we stop here.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you for reading my mind in terms of the time. Maybe you could send the presentation and to us, and we can see how we can make it available. Before we go into questions, we would like to invite our members to share some of their experiences. We will hear back to back from 3 different organizations and their representatives. First, we will hear from Gordon John, Natural Resource Management Program Coordinator from the Pacos Trust, which is a community-based organization dedicated to supporting indigenous peoples in Sabah, Malaysia. Then we will hear from Katy Marcelo Lopez, who's president of ONAMIA, a Peruvian organization of indigenous women from the Andes and the Amazon, fighting for the full recognition and exercise of their individual as well as collective rights. And then we will hear from Guillermo Schir, Provincial Director of PIDP in the Democratic Republic of Congo, an organization that fights to defend the human rights of the indigenous Pygmy people of Bambuti on the cultural, social, economic, and environmental fronts. Gordon, why don't you start first? Thank you. And we'll have 6 minutes each. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Gordon. I'm from Sabah, actually, Sabah, Malaysia. So I will, well, talking about IPs in Sabah, we have very challenging situation, especially on our land rights. When talking about land rights, although we have our native customary rights, but it always insecure because of the government favor on development instead of conservation. So meaning to say, whenever there's a development, it means that our land, especially our watershed area, our conservation area, our forests, our mangrove will destroy for the sake of development. And in addition of that, also there's a significant overlap exists between customary territories and state-controlled protected areas, such as the national parks, the forest reserve, which result the inclusion of IPs of their territories, and they have safeguard and sustainably used and utilized throughout the generation. And despite all of these challenges, the communities continue to protect their territories. They do this through community mapping, including on their area. They have these protocols, which mean their custom and their law, customary law, saying that, like, one good example is the Sogian, where it's a communal use, and Sogindai mean there's no go zone. It's a protected area. And one good example also that Morazio mentioned in the LBO, the Local Biodiversity Outlook, one good example is the Tagal system, which mean that we use and we protect the area. And nevertheless, also this Tagal system also has been also mentioned in our NB sub. Yeah. Despite all the critical roles of IPs playing in biodiversity conservation and also climate change mitigation, their involvement are very little to no, yeah, because of and the decision making are still insufficient. One good example is when the government, they want to review their NBSUP last year. It's very little of the IP were involved. Little to no one IP were involved in the reviewing of the NBSUP. Nevertheless, there's a few that been mentioned in the goals of the NBSUP, such as in Goal 2, Action 2.1. They were saying that empowering IPLCs, but there's no participation going on. This is like very it's not happening. And even though in Action 2.4 in the NBSUP, the Malaysia NBSUP, mentioning that the decision making and strengthening the FPIC process, but still there's no consultation, there's no proper and meaningful participation by the IPLCs. Yeah. Nevertheless, also in Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in Target 3, they was mentioning about, you know, the indigenous traditional territory as the third pathway for conservation. Still, it's very little of the ICCAs or the traditional territory of IP has been recognized until now. There's a lot of challenging where we are still being encroached by companies and also loggers destroying our forests. Yeah, even though it's been mentioned that in Goal 3 in NBSUP was saying that, oh, there's an enhanced management effectiveness between the IPLCs, and also there was also mentioned about to identify and recognize of the customary and conservation area, but still it's not been implemented in the ground. Yeah. So this is where something that is very challenging for all of us. especially in Sabah. But in PACOS, we have three prolonged strategies. One is to document their traditional knowledge, documentation of their territory, customary territory, building capacities to the communities, and also giving a network between the communities, and also between the communities locally, nationally, and internationally. And the third one is advocacy to the relevant agency on the community-led conservation. So this is when we never lose hope. We're really looking forward for collaboration, and I think this is also a good chance and good opportunity for IPLC to speak up, because before this, it's very hard. There's no involvement at all. I mean, there's no engagement from the government to the community about what is NBSAP. And until now, we giving awareness to the community on what is NBSAP is all about, and why is it very important for them, and how they can contribute to the NBSAP. So this is something still ongoing. It's a learning process, but our hope and our vision is one day IPLC-led conservation will be the prime example for the Malaysian NBSAP. So I think that's pretty much from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. We will now move to Peru. Katie, please, you have the word. Katie.
Bueno, buenas tardes o buenas noches por allá. Buenas tardes. Agradecer a la ILC por la invitación y bueno, yo voy a compartir las reflexiones desde las mujeres indígenas, ¿no? Con respecto a la diversidad biológica. En el Perú se viene realizando el proceso de actualización de la Estrategia Nacional de Diversidad Biológica, en la cual nosotras hemos pedido como organización que sea sometido a consulta previa, porque desde el Estado había la intención de realizar tan solo una aportes participativos nada más, pero sin realizar la consulta previa. Y bueno, eso ha sido también uno de los argumentos que hemos tenido de acuerdo al mandato de la COP15, ¿no? de alguna de las decisiones, y en la cual para nosotros los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos y las mujeres indígenas, la diversidad biológica no solamente es lo que se ve, ¿no? Sino es todas las vidas que habitan en nuestro territorio. Para nosotros, pues, significa la defensa de todas las vidas. Entonces, y para nosotros es una gran oportunidad también participar en este proceso de actualización de la Estrategia Nacional de Diversidad Biológica. Sin embargo, yo podría decir que en el Perú se ratifica, ¿no? Este convenio de la diversidad biológica en el año 1993, lo cual ya tiene 30 años en nuestro país. Sin embargo, ese año también se empieza un modelo económico extractivista, un modelo económico que arrasa con todas las vidas de nuestros territorios, sin consulta previa y consentimiento. Entonces, para nosotros significa muy preocupante, y justo como pueblos empezar a participar justo 30 años después de la ratificación del convenio. Bueno, estamos en el Perú frente a un modelo económico que privilegia las actividades extractivas y la destrucción de la biodiversidad. Con este proceso de actualización de esta Estrategia Nacional de Diversidad Biológica, para nosotros pues es una gran oportunidad para visibilizar las causas y los responsables de esta destrucción de la biodiversidad. Entonces, nosotros vemos con mucha preocupación cómo las concesiones se han venido dando en nuestros territorios sin importar las vidas que ahí habitan en nuestros territorios. Entonces, eh, ahí y a pedido de las organizaciones hemos venido nosotras participando también, construyendo desde el problema público, para lo cual esta actualización también es hasta el 2050, en la cual nosotros como pueblos indígenas hemos estado aportando a la metodología del proceso en la cual entre organizaciones hemos venido discutiendo lo que a lo largo de los años cómo nos impacta en nuestro territorio y cómo también nosotros hemos venido defendiendo las vidas que habitan en nuestros territorios. Y uno de los problemas públicos que hemos identificado es el incremento del deterioro, disminución y extinción de la biodiversidad del territorio en la zona andina, Pachamama, o la madre naturaleza y la diversidad cultural. Eso es uno de los grandes problemas que enfrentamos justamente debido al extractivismo, al modelo económico que destruye todas las vidas. No solamente es de la destrucción, pues, de los árboles, de la biodiversidad que existe, sino también la destrucción de nuestras vidas y cómo nosotros como pueblo miramos, ¿no? Todas las vidas que existen en nuestro territorio. Y también lo que habíamos consensuado como las 7 organizaciones nacionales al 2050 es pues el Perú recupera, restaura, promueve, protege y restablece su relación espiritual con la madre naturaleza, reconociendo y valorando el territorio integral y la cosmovisión de los pueblos indígenas, aprovechando sosteniblemente la Pachamama, evitando su pérdida, deterioro y explotación para el buen vivir. Para nosotros los pueblos indígenas, esta propuesta al 2050 es un gran reto, ¿no? Es un desafío sobre todo porque con políticas públicas no se va a solucionar las políticas extractivas que destruyen a nuestros territorios. Entonces, nosotros como pueblos, pues, seguimos apostando por la construcción de estas propuestas sostenibles como pueblos indígenas, ¿no? En este proceso, sí. Hemos visto también que en el Perú el Ministerio de Ambiente es un ministerio bastante débil, ¿no? El financiamiento del Tesoro Público no va tanto para, por ejemplo, para financiar estos procesos de construcción de esta estrategia, sino estamos caminando a voluntad de la cooperación internacional y el Perú actualmente se encuentra en una crisis política, social, en la cual tampoco es garantía de que este proceso se vaya a lograr. Entonces, para nosotros es muy preocupante como organizaciones ver cómo no podemos llegar, ¿no? A la próxima COP con nuestras propuestas. Sin embargo, estamos haciendo todos los esfuerzos desde nuestras organizaciones, desde nuestros territorios, para poder seguir construyendo procesos. Y lo interesante de este proceso de construcción ha sido, pues, nuestras mismas voces, nuestras mismas metodologías, el Estado, si bien es cierto, propone sus metodologías, pero nosotros como pueblos nos estamos reuniendo y estamos discutiendo las problemáticas al interior de nuestros, qué es lo que sucede en nuestros territorios y cómo podemos también ir proponiendo y poniendo ahí pues algunas propuestas, por ejemplo, como generar normas y políticas que garanticen la protección de la madre naturaleza. No sabemos que esto pasa también por un cambio constitucional, porque nosotros, si queremos proteger la biodiversidad, tenemos que proteger la vida de la Pachamama, la vida de la madre naturaleza. Y en el Perú hemos estado pues promoviendo, por ejemplo, la ley, ¿no? Que se considere a la madre naturaleza como sujeta de derecho, como nosotros los pueblos indígenas miramos, que no solamente se reconozca pues a un río, que se reconozca a un cerro, sino es como nosotros los seres humanos, no me puedes reconocer solo el brazo, solo la pierna, sino todo, porque todo tiene vida para nosotros. Sin embargo, esto pasa por el gran desafío también del cambio de paradigma, ¿no? Frente a un modelo antropocentrista que está vigente en nuestro país. Y para nosotros los pueblos indígenas exigir esta consulta previa, ¿no? Con consentimiento, que se, que se garanticen nuestras propuestas también representa un desafío enorme. No solamente basta con que el Perú haya ratificado el convenio, sino también que se acepten, que se acepten sobre todo nuestras propuestas, nuestras voces, y sobre todo porque estamos haciendo un proceso bastante interesante, participativo en el Perú, y porque nosotras las organizaciones indígenas lo estamos exigiendo así. Queremos que todas nuestras propuestas, nuestros sentimientos estén plasmados en esta estrategia nacional de la diversidad biológica. Y bueno, seguimos, ¿no? Para nosotros es muy importante construir este proceso al 2050, pero también representa un desafío. Gracias.
Thank you, Katie. We will now move to Diel, to DRC. Diel, please.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Monsieur Dielmo Chiremwenge. Je suis de la République démocratique du Congo. Et je fais partie de la communauté autochtone pygmée avec laquelle je travaille depuis une vingtaine d'années pour essayer de voir comment arriver à promouvoir et valoriser tout ce qui est lié à la discrimination. Notre motivation ici, c'est vraiment voir les expériences dont on a eu à capitaliser depuis tout ce temps, aller avec la connexion avec la nature, la conservation et la transmission des savoirs traditionnels, qui est vraiment la socle de notre identité. Et chez nous, on dit toujours que d'abord, on ne conserve pas pour personne, mais on conserve pour nous-mêmes parce que l'argent ne se bouffe pas. Nous avons eu à mettre en place des initiatives comme la foresterie communautaire, qui est un cadre légal reconnu en République démocratique du Congo, en organisant des tables rondes, et ainsi de suite. Et cela ne nous a pas totalement arrangé. Et l'approche APAC nous a beaucoup stimulé. L'APAC sont les aires et territoires communautaires et autochtones. Donc, sont là les espaces de vie des peuples autochtones. Et vu que la loi avait limité ça à 50 000 hectares, pendant que nous avons des milliers des espaces où il y a la biodiversité, où il y a des forêts que nous gardons et nous gérons de manière durable, nous avions estimé que cette approche serait vraiment plus performante pour nous. Et notre aspect, c'est, en termes d'opportunités, c'est le cadre international. Au niveau de la RDC, en plus de la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones, la Convention 169, mais aussi d'autres instruments liés avec les droits de l'homme, nous disposons quand même d'un cadre légal national en lien
Many
avec
legal instruments also about conservation, but they do not consider explicitly clearly the rights of indigenous people in our country. Here, we talk about conservation, and everybody knows that it is a question of protected areas. So this is not the case, because protected areas were issued and granted also thanks to people, also thanks to what means protected areas for the communities, belonging to communities. And that there were all kinds of violations, because indigenous people didn't have any rights or obligations, didn't have the right to work, for example, to have a job. In the past, we have succeeded in implementing a framework in order to draw up a strategy for the preservation outside protected areas. That means that all areas outside the protected areas preserved by indigenous people, recognized as desert, as community, as forest belonging to indigenous people, must be used within the framework of the implementation of mechanism of protection of soil and land. So since that, I can say that it's my honor to be here, and I would like to thank ILC and all partners that helped us in reaching our goals, and within the framework of the drawing up of the next action plan, the RDC will create a task force for which indigenous people can also participate, and their voices are heard and their wishes are considered. In addition, on top of all the organizations, for example, urban planning, desert and land organization, the forests policy, the land policy, or indigenous people's policies, all of these must aim the preservation of the rights of indigenous people. But since there's always this aspect of the illegal exploitation of resources in these territories, mechanisms are not very well implemented by the government in Congo in order to face and fight against these exploitations, illegal exploitations. Mining exploitation, for example, the exploitation of forests, mining activities, all these have consequences on our lives. There's a connection also with the well-being of women, of people in general, of women. There's a link also with the exploitation of forests, because, for example, they cut all our forests. And there's also a problem that comes from that, the problem, for example, of pharmacopoeia. So if we want to eat something from the forest, if we want to be treated by the products of the forests, and find healing mechanisms and treatments from the forest. Our traditional knowledge comes from the forest. So we must include them. We must include all the threats that are on us, because I thank you, because these exchanges, debates, allow us to create and draw up strategies and suggestions for that our territories are very well secured, well preserved by ourselves and not by our others, those who are in conflict with ourselves and with our community too. For example, the national parks, for example, the national park of Salonga, there are many, many cases there of violation of rights, and they say that the preservation is not linked to human rights, for example. There is no conservation without human rights, and vice versa. These two things are interdependent and interconnected in order to reach the point where we can live, when we can have a fight against climate change. So, and we think that by reaching the strategy and implementing the strategy, Congo will be one of the countries that might reach the goal also of the conventions. And the framework, the Kunming-Montreal framework too. So we think that it's a very well strategy, and we are trying to mobilize all the stakeholders in order to activate it and participate in it, and give us instruments, technical tools, and material instruments to make mapping, for example, activities, analyzing things, making anthropological studies, for that, according to which communities can know these lands are not very well recognized, we know, and in addition, on top of that, there's also all the things that are happening. I think that the question of, well, the exploitation.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have to come to an end, so we still have some time for discussion. I'm sorry.
Oui, j'ai fini vraiment, merci.
Well,
C'est
I would like to end. I was saying that by preserving biodiversity, we preserve our traditions and the future of our youth. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'd like to open for discussion. Please, if anybody who has a question, raise the hand or put the question in the chat. In the meantime, if there is none yet, there's one. Let me check. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. 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 Yes. So, Esther, could you speak to it? I can't quite find it. Could you just say out your question loud?
Hi, hello, good evening from
Thank you,
Manila.
Esther.
Thank you, Joanna. But my question is, what constituency groups are engaging in UN-CBD processes right now? Second is, what governments are supportive of agro-biodiversity so we can work with them? And third is, what are the opportunities and challenges in accessing biodiversity funds? Because what we know is there is already biodiversity funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Who wants to answer those? Mauricio, Amelia, do you want to go first?
Hello. Perhaps I can try to address the first question in terms of which are the constituencies. Mauricio, if I missed something, please compliment. So far, there are different rights holders, constituencies or rights holders groups engaging with the CBD or within the CBD space. One of it is the IIFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which voices the indigenous peoples and local communities issues. There's also the CBD Women's Caucus, which is the women's major group open to any individual interested or working on human rights, gender, and biodiversity. And there is also the youth constituency, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, also open to any individual younger than 35 years old, interested in pushing for youth and intergenerational equity and future generations' rights. And those are the rights holders groups that I understand that exist in the CBD space. But you also have other stakeholders groups such as the CBD Alliance, which is the space for the civil society or national non-governmental organizations or local or smaller NGOs to engage with the CBD process. And answering the third question about the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, perhaps also Mauricio can also complement on that one. So far, this fund is starting to set up its working its working process. It is a fund under the process of the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility. And trying to make this simple is that the ones that can access the funds are the countries which are parties or members of the conventions that the GEF manage the money for, meaning the CBD, the UNCCD, and the Climate Convention. But the civil society is highly engaged somehow because the projects that the parties propose to this fund to receive the money for are or should be developed and implemented with in collaboration with local organizations or national organizations. There is a pledge that was announced in the GEF Assembly last year, and I guess many of you have heard about, that the GBFF money should be allocated, at least 20% of it, to IPs and LCs. But how does that look? It's really not clear yet. It is seems that it's gonna go through the governments, and as long as they say that that money is being used or directed to address IPs and LCs questions or provisions or needs, that will count as towards that 20%, but that doesn't necessarily mean direct access. And that could be a longer discussion, but I will stop here, and I'm really happy that that question has brought. Perhaps Marisa, you can complement on that and on the agrobiodiversity, because I'm not really sure about which are the concrete countries supporting that.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks a lot, Esther, for the question, for the questions. Yeah, just to complement very briefly on which constituencies, there are also academia and also business actually do participate. I think there has been a tendency over the years in the CBD to really realize that states, governments, have not been able to achieve the goals of the CBD. So especially in the last 10 years, I would say, and with the negotiation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there is a much bigger opening. And that's why one of the key considerations is the whole of society approach. So there is a realization that governments cannot do it alone. And, their role, especially with Indigenous people in local communities, women and youth, has been recognized more and more. And that's why I think more space has been given to these rights holders. So it is, I fully agree. And, thanks a lot to Katie Gordon and DL for sharing, the challenges, at the national and local level. I mean, we are dealing with enormous challenges here, and, an economic model which has been affecting, nature and people in very deep ways. So to change that model, it's not happening overnight for sure. But I think we have to look at the step-by-step approach on how things can improve at the national and local level. So making use of the positive development, like, in the GBF and some of the text on human rights and the role of Indigenous people, communities, women and youth, is an improvement, is a good starting point. Okay, now in terms of which specific parties are supporting agrobiodiversity, I think one, here it really depends on who from the governments participate at different CBD meetings, because governments change their positions as well. I think one of the governments that has been supporting, the rights of Mother Nature, the rights of Indigenous people and local communities, and agrobiodiversity, maybe one of the more consistent one has been Bolivia, because it's always been quite strongly supportive of these issues. The other ones, they change, they change over time. Sometimes, the government of the Philippines itself has been positive, not always. So it depends. It depends on who is there. It depends on what the current, government policies are. Some of the European countries, sometimes, some of the other Latin American countries, usually the Pacific island states, because they've quite a lot of indigenous peoples living there. They've been supportive as well, but it's never sure. So I think one of the actions that indigenous local communities, women and youth needs to be constantly aware is actually to start discussing with their own governments before going to the CBD meetings about the positions, so that they can also have dialogue and influence their governments before they go to these meetings. So I'm not sure actually within the meeting today whether there are representatives from governments or from organizations that work very close with governments, because it might be useful to hear from them as well if any is present today. Thanks.
Thank you, Mauricio. I think this is a great transition to give the word to Olivier from the CBD Secretariat, who surely works closely with governments and maybe can also shed some more light on some of these things that we've discussed. Olivier, could you, floor is yours. 5 minutes max, if that's okay, and then we'll run just a few minutes over before we close.
Sure. Thank you, Johanna. It's a big challenge to just wrap everything up in 5 minutes, but I'll try my best. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity. I think it's quite important to engage in this discussion. Very quickly, having listened to what the different interventions, I think one thing to point out when we deal with NVSAPs, that the NVSAPs are not an end to themselves. And I think Mauricio mentioned that it's the principal instrument of the CBD, and you're absolutely right about this. But it should be a process of engagement, a process in which, in the ideal situation, the constituencies that we're discussing here with women, indigenous peoples, and local communities should be, in a way, interacting in a way that actually contribute to that process. Not just to the end in itself, but to the process, which is right important. So I just want to also use this opportunity, Johanna, if you allow me, to sort of maybe point out some entry points that maybe will answer some of the questions that were raised. In terms of entry points, in the CBD process, and it was correctly mentioned also, we have this section C of the framework, which is quite important. And I think that's a very important entry point in terms of like dealing with rights issue and dealing with the fact that the framework should be implemented in a whole society and a whole of government approach, which I think is quite useful. We also have other entry points. Thank you, Amelia, for mentioning the Gender Plan of Action, which has really guidance. It's a tool for implementation that actually should be complementary to the National Biodiversity and Action Plans because it contains more detail. It's meant to contain more detail as to the means of implementation. And I think that's quite important. Let's not also forget that we have within the CBD process, and here I'm speaking specifically to the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, we have under development a new program of work, which include issues related to land rights. And also gender consideration and also youth. So I think there where we have this program developed and adopted at COP16 will also provide an important entry point to further some of the issues that we're discussing here. To end, to answer some of the questions, yes, the GBF fund is there. The GBF fund is meant to be aspirational in terms of the contribution, the 20% contribution. The modalities still need to be worked out, and the engagement of civil society in general is important in that process. We have to also look at models that exist, the small grants program, for example, by UNDP. How could that be extended? We're in discussions with the various actors in this. And I think this is also something that needs to be sort of taken into account. Lastly, and I close here because the time, when we're talking about land rights, when we're talking about issues related to gender, Indigenous people and local communities, and it's something that was not really emphasized here, mainstreaming and also creating synergies with other conventions and other framework is quite important. There was a question about related to agriculture. So with regards to the implementation of the framework, for example, FAO is providing some tools and guidance, which also relate to land. And we also have, of course, the Rio Conventions, UNCCD, that needs to sort of also play a role in this. So that will be it for myself. Again, thanks again for the invitation, and be happy to answer further questions via email or other means. And thanks, Johan.
Thank you, Olivier. And we're coming to an end now. Before we wanted to close, I just wanted to also raise that we at ILC are starting a new rapid response financing facility called the Global Land Catalyst Fund for National Land Coalitions, which will be specifically supporting financing for the national land coalitions at ILC to engage in processes such as MB-Subs, as well as other spaces of relevance in the biodiversity as well as climate space. With this, I'd like to close the event and thank you again all for attending. I would like to thank our wonderful speakers, Maurizio, Amelia, Gordon, Cathy, and Diel, and Olivier. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your experiences and your knowledge. We hope this is the first of more discussions like this and more engagement and support for national level engagement in this very important space. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks, over to you. Bye-bye.